The night sky over Virginia in 1827 lit up like a furnace as flames roared through the Whitmore plantation, painting the horizon in deep shades of orange and red that could be seen for miles. Clara Robinson had soaked the cotton fields in lamp oil and struck the spark herself, watching with steady eyes as years of forced labor turned to ash in an instant. By morning, only her burned footprints were found vanishing into the forest and into legend. Why had she chosen that moment to set fire to everything she had been forced to build? And how did she escape without a trace from one of the most guarded regions in the South that day had begun like so many before it? On September 15th, the plantation bell rattled through the darkness at 4:30 a.m., just as it had for the 12 years since Clara, sold at 16, had arrived at Whitmore. She slipped into her patched cotton dress inside the slave quarters, where 23 others stirred from restless sleep. The air filled with coughs and the shuffle of bare feet. Clara's movements were quiet, her mind wandering briefly to memories of her mother Josephine, who had died when Clara was 10. She carried the sound of her mother's songs in their native tongue, and a tiny cloth pouch of seeds from Ghana sewn secretly into her dress pressed close to her heart, something no master could ever claim as his property. As she stepped outside, the dawn spread across endless rows of cotton ready for harvest. Normally, this sight filled her with a grim resolve, but that morning felt different. 3 days earlier, Moses, a free man from Richmond, had passed her a letter carried through hidden channels. Though Denmark Vesey had been executed 6 years before, his spirit lived on in whispers of rebellion. The letter spoke of a coordinated strike with September 20th, chosen as the night enslaved people across multiple states would rise together, creating diversions so others could flee north toward freedom. Clara had burned the letter after memorizing every word, but its message smoldered inside her like a second fire. She had perfected invisibility over 12 years, obedient, silent, quick to work, earning small freedoms like working in distant fields or traveling to Richmond with goods. But that disguise was over. She knew now she would not spend the rest of her life harvesting cotton under the lash. The only thing left was to decide how she would use her invisibility one last time to burn the world built on her suffering and vanish into the trees before anyone could stop her. Clara had come to realize that invisibility wasn't just survival, it was resistance. Master Whitmore and his overseer Jeremiah Davidson thought she was nothing more than another body in the fields, a pair of hands picking their wealth from the soil. But behind lowered eyes and quiet obedience, Clara had been studying, waiting, learning. She knew every acre of the plantation, every hidden trail through the surrounding woods, every weakness in the system designed to keep her chained. The cotton rows stretched endlessly in the heat, each plant a reminder of stolen labor and stolen lives. Her hands worked out of habit, pulling cotton bolls with the speed 12 years had carved into her, the sack across her shoulder growing heavy as the day wore on. But her mind wasn't in the fields. It was mapping distances, picturing the sheds near the main house, calculating how long it would take for fire to spread. Whitmore's pride was in those 3 storage sheds where cotton was dried and stored before being carted to Richmond. They held not only the present crop, but also the seeds and tools that secured the plantation's future. Clara had long suspected those sheds were the plantation's weak heart, and Benjamin, the old carpenter, had confirmed it. He was nearly 70, once a free man, before being stolen north and sold south, his skills in wood and iron making him indispensable. While repairing a shed roof with her, he had casually pointed out that the tar-soaked shingles could burn hotter and faster than most wood, especially if doused with oil. Clara had tucked that fact away, not knowing then how valuable it would become. Now she understood it was knowledge meant for her moment. The sheds were close enough to reach, but far enough not to risk the lives of her people. A single spark could turn them into an inferno, a fire so large it would pull every white man into a frenzy, leaving the enslaved their best chance in years to disappear into the forest. Clara could lead them if she wished she knew the wild paths, the swamps, the hidden routes that fed into the Underground Railroad. But escape wasn't her true aim. Too many had run before only to be hunted down, dragged back, broken, or killed. Even those who reached the north sometimes found themselves captured again under the Fugitive Slave Act. Clara wanted something deeper, something lasting. She wanted to send a message. Fire wouldn't just destroy cotton. It would burn into the minds of Whitmore and his neighbors, a reminder that their power rested on fear, and that fear could be shattered. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields, Clara's decision hardened. Tomorrow night, September 16th, she would act. By striking 4 days before the planned uprising in South Carolina, her fire would look like a lone act of defiance, protecting the wider conspiracy while still serving as a powerful distraction. That night, she sat in the quarters with her people, eating the same meager meal of cornbread, bacon grease, and garden scraps, chewing without tasting. Her body was there, but her thoughts were already with the flame that would rise tomorrow, the fire that would turn her invisibility into something unforgettable. Clara knew that every detail mattered now. One mistake, one careless move, and everything she had planned would collapse before it began. She had only a day to gather what she needed, and she couldn't afford to raise the slightest suspicion. The lamp oil would be the hardest to get. Master Whitmore locked it down tightly, well aware of what damage it could cause in the wrong hands. But Clara had noticed something over the years. Davidson, the overseer, had a fondness for corn liquor that often left him sloppy. More than once he'd forgotten to secure supplies properly after stumbling drunk from the barn. If she timed it right, his weakness might become her opportunity. After supper, she walked to the small garden patch behind the slave quarters, the one she kept for the plantation kitchen. On the surface, it was simple duty, but it also gave her an excuse to move freely after dark. As she weeded and checked the rows, she wasn't thinking about vegetables at all. Her mind was running through every step of tomorrow night. The moon would be nearly full, just enough light to guide her without a torch, but not so much that it would expose her. The wind had stayed steady from the southeast 3 days in a row, which meant the fire would push toward the big house and away from the quarters. The damage would fall on Whitmore, not on her people. She also knew what came after. Once the flames took hold, she would have perhaps an hour before men organized into search parties. She didn't intend to spend that hour running for her own freedom. Instead, she would use it to spread word among the cabins, urging others to take the chance the chaos provided. Over the years, she had quietly gathered names and routes connected to the Underground Railroad. She planned to pass that knowledge along to anyone bold enough to risk the journey north. The next day, the bell dragged her from sleep as always, and she walked to the fields with the others, her face unreadable. But she picked faster than ever before, filling her sack by mid-afternoon and earning permission to finish the day in the vegetable garden. That small reward gave her the space she needed to check her hidden stashes and finalize her plan. By nightfall, everything was ready. In the quarters, she lay motionless in her bunk, waiting. Years of experience had trained her ear to tell the difference between the breathing of real sleep and the careful stillness of someone awake. Only when she was certain that the others were lost in deep slumber did she rise, and she moved carefully across the floorboards, stepping only where she knew they would stay silent, her body remembering the path she had practiced over and over. The door creaked open just wide enough for her to slip outside. The night air carried the scent of cotton and faint wood smoke from the big house kitchen. Clara crossed the yard like a shadow, pausing often to listen, her senses sharp for any sign of movement. At the barn, she found what she had hoped for, Davidson sprawled in his office chair, drunk beyond awareness, an empty jug of corn liquor at his elbow. And there, dangling from his belt, were the keys she needed, the keys to the supply room and the lamp oil that would set everything in motion. Clara's heart hammered as she eased the keys from Davidson's belt fingers, trembling the whole time, and slipped into the supply room where the air smelled sharp with oil and metal. She found 3 ceramic jugs of lamp oil, a coil of rope, and a small hand axe, and she moved them 1 jug at a time in 4 quiet trips, keeping the liquid from sloshing and hiding each load in a hollow behind the largest drying shed. The sheds were Whitmore's pride and the plantation's linchpin, built of pines soaked with pitch and tar, and stuffed inside with bales of processed cotton and the seeds and tools that meant another year of profit. That very construction made them a vulnerability-treated shingles and tarred wood, burn hotter and faster, and cotton that seemed so soft and white would sting like tinder once it caught. At 2 a.m, when the world had thinned to wind and breath, Clara set to work using the axe to make small holes in the shed walls, just big enough to pour oil through, then slipping inside those cracks to bathe the most flammable piles and seams in the clear liquid until the cotton and timber drank it in. She worked slowly and thoroughly in the dark, the smell of oil and dust filling her nose, checking each corner twice, knowing a missed patch could mean failure. By the time the eastern sky paled toward dawn, she had soaked the interiors and then gone back around the outside, dousing walls and roofs until dark stains marked where the accelerant lay. For the finale, she made 3 torches from rags, wrapped on pine branches, lighting them from 1 small flame, so the fires would start together and overwhelm any quick response. And then she stood in the shadows, timing everything down to heartbeats, ready to strike, so the blaze would pull every hand toward the flames and give others, if they chose a chance, to slip into the woods. The lamp oil caught with a low rushing sound that seemed far louder than it was splitting the stillness of the hour before dawn. In moments, the fire leapt up the walls of the sheds, the tarred pine wood swallowing flame, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Clara had prepared for the sight, but even she was startled at how quickly the inferno grew. The roofs lit with orange tongues of fire, shingles popping and crackling, while inside the cotton bales became fuel, sending thick white smoke into the sky like a beacon. For the first time in her life, Clara stood before something she had chosen, an act born not of obedience, but defiance, and the power of it held her frozen for a heartbeat longer than she intended. The heat pushed her back, the air shimmering as the blaze roared to life. This was no simple destruction. This was a message written in fire across the Virginia sky. Anyone within miles would see it, enslaved and free alike. But she had no time to marvel. The window she had carved out for herself was shrinking with every second. She sprinted toward the quarters, calling quietly to those who would listen. Benjamin was already awake, drawn by the glow. His face was lined with shock, but his voice carried something else: respect. "Child, what have you done?" he whispered, though he already knew. Clara explained in hurried words, telling him and others of the routes she had mapped, the contacts she had gathered, the chance that might never come again. Some of the younger men and women leaned in with wide eyes, ready to seize the moment. Others shook their heads, torn by the weight of children and elders they could not leave behind. Behind her, the fire had grown into a roar, consuming the 3 sheds with a fury that rattled the night. From the main house, lights flickered to life. The Whitmore family poured into the yard, their shouts colliding with the crackle of burning timber. Overseer Davidson stumbled from the barn, clutching his liquor jug, staggering in disbelief as he faced the destruction he had failed to guard against. Then Whitmore himself appeared, raging and frantic, barking orders to men who had no hope of controlling the blaze. Clara, hidden in the shifting shadows, clutched her small bundle, her mother's seed pouch, the knife she had kept for years, and felt the weight of her decision settle into her bones. She had struck the blow she promised herself she would, and now the fire was no longer hers. It belonged to everyone who could see its light and feel what it meant. It belonged to those who still believed freedom was possible. Cotton and machinery worth thousands were going up in smoke, and with them, the promise of Whitmore's future fortune. Just as Clara had predicted, the plantation scrambled into action. Riders tore down the roads toward Richmond to call in help and report what was clearly no accident, while others sped to neighboring estates, spreading warnings of fire and whispers of rebellion. She knew what that meant. Within an hour, the countryside would swarm with armed men, dogs, and overseers bent on hunting her down. But by then, Clara had no intention of being anywhere near Whitmore's land. As the blaze raged brightest and the white men poured their attention into saving what they could, Clara slipped silently into the forest along its eastern edge. For 12 years, those woods had been her retreat, a place where she gathered herbs, cleared her head, and imagined a world beyond the fields. Now, the same trails that had offered comfort would become her escape routes, carrying her toward an unknown future that at least promised something different from chains. She moved fast, but careful, keeping to the shadows and avoiding open ground where riders might spot her. The Virginia wilderness stretched on in every direction. Rivers, swamps, tangled hills, and she knew from whispered stories that fugitives had survived here for years, building hidden camps and whole communities in the deep timber. Others, she knew, had followed the secret line of the Underground Railroad, guided by free black men, abolitionists, and a few white allies who risked everything to help. Clara carried in her memory a network of names, places, and directions passed quietly between cabins at night, maps stitched together from fragments of rumor and lived experience. When dawn began to break through the canopy, Clara stopped and turned back. Through the trees, she could still see smoke rising in thick columns, the fire refusing to die. The sight filled her with pride and dread all at once. She had struck a blow that mattered, but she had also left behind people she loved, like family. 12 years of shared nights and whispered dreams bound her to the men, women, and children still at Whitmore. She had urged them to come, and some had listened, but most stayed, choosing safety or at least familiarity over the perilous uncertainty of flight. Clara understood. No one could make that choice for another. Her own decision had been forming for years, carved by every lash, every broken promise, every cruelty she had seen. The letter about a wider resistance had only lit the final spark. The truth was simpler. She refused to let her life be owned. With that conviction, Clara pressed deeper into the wilderness, her feet finding their way across roots and creek beds she knew by heart. Behind her, the smoke still climbed, marking her defiance for anyone who cared to see, while ahead of her lay nothing but danger and possibility, both of which felt for the first time entirely her own. Clara knew the men hunting her would need time to sort themselves out. The woods offered countless paths, and without clear tracks, their chase would scatter in every direction. Soon the sound of hooves and shouting rolled through the trees, a harsh reminder that she was far from safe. She caught Davidson's voice among them. Drunk anger now replaced by frantic commands, joined by planters from nearby estates who had answered Whitmore's call. Their frustration carried through the morning air as they bickered about which trail to follow. But Clara had already slipped beyond their reach. She used the land the way only someone who had walked it for years could, skirting their lines, staying low and angling northeast toward the routes whispered of in hidden meetings. While they assumed she dashed north for freedom, Clara chose a slower, more winding path. Natural barriers and her own knowledge would cover her better than speed. Each hour she pressed forward, their voices grew weaker, until at last they were little more than echoes lost among the trees. By midday, Clara reached a creek she knew from herb-gathering trips. The cool water wrapped her feet in relief as she stepped into it, the stream washing away her scent and shielding her from dogs. She moved steadily through the shallows, her body weary, but her spirit locked on survival. Birds wheeled overhead, fish darted beneath her steps, and for the first time since striking the torch, the forest sounded almost peaceful. Toward evening, as the sun dropped westward, the landmark she had prayed for appeared: a mill on the creek bend, its chimney smoking grindstones humming. Just as the letter had promised. Clara approached warily, scanning for traps or signs of betrayal. But the mill looked ordinary, lived in. Its keeper, Joseph, a wiry man with weathered hands and sharp eyes, seemed to recognize her purpose without a word. He ushered her inside, offered food and a change of clothes, and spoke in the calm, certain tone of someone who had guided many before her. Over supper, Joseph shared what the countryside was already saying. The fire had gutted Whitmore's empire, 3 sheds of cotton and equipment gone in one night. The blaze, he said, had been seen from Richmond itself. Clara felt a jolt of satisfaction at the confirmation. Her message had traveled farther than she could have dreamed. Whitmore's fortune was ash, and his power cracked with it. They've got men and hounds crawling all over those woods, Joseph told her. But they're chasing ghosts. The fire drew their eyes. But your trail's cold. You've given them shadows to hunt. Clara listened, steady and silent, but inside she knew the truth. Her fire was more than destruction. It was proof that even in a world built on chains, there was still room for choice, for defiance, for one woman to bend the night to her will. By the time the hunters realized where she had really gone, Clara would be far beyond their reach. At the mill, Joseph laid out the road ahead in careful detail, describing the safe houses and contact points of the underground railroad that stretched like a hidden lifeline northward. Each station was placed 20 or 30 miles apart, far enough to keep pursuers guessing, but close enough to offer weary travelers food, shelter, and direction. His instructions carried Clara not just out of Virginia, but toward the promise of Pennsylvania and the states beyond. As night fell, Joseph sent her off with supplies, a blanket, and the knowledge that a Quaker settlement lay 2 days' journey north. The Quakers, he explained, had long been among the most steadfast allies of freedom seekers, their faith compelling them to resist slavery despite the risks. Clara slipped away under cover of darkness, walking the same secret trail that dozens had taken before her. The flames of Whitmore Plantation already felt like something from another life, though less than a day had passed. She pressed through the cool September night, the blanket wrapped close her eyes on the stars that guided her. By dawn, she had covered 15 miles, her body sore, but her spirit unbroken. Ahead lay a valley farm, run by the Patterson family Quakers, whose land was shielded by wooded hills that offered perfect concealment. Martha Patterson, a woman with calm strength in her face, greeted Clara without hesitation. Like Joseph, she asked nothing about the past, focusing instead on food, clothing, and rest. "Thou hast traveled far and endured much," Martha said gently, "but the hardest part of thy road is still before thee." Slave catchers guard the routes north with sharp eyes and heavier purses than ever. The Pattersons had turned their farm into a quiet fortress of compassion over the last 15 years. Hidden passages, coded signals, and careful routines allowed them to shelter countless fugitives without drawing suspicion from neighbors eager to earn bounty money. Clara remained there for 3 days, gathering her strength while the network arranged her passage forward. During that time, news reached the farm about Whitmore Plantation. Investigators had determined the fire was the work of one person, not part of a larger conspiracy. That conclusion meant the September 20th uprising elsewhere in the South would not face added scrutiny, its secrecy intact. Clara felt the satisfaction of her plan fulfilled. The fire had been both a devastating blow and a successful diversion. She had set her world ablaze, and from its ashes, others would rise to take their chance at freedom. Clara's fire had done more than buy her a chance at escape. It had protected an entire movement. By drawing the eyes of planters and patrols to Whitmore's plantation, She had cleared the way for uprisings and escapes that might free hundreds more across the South. At the Patterson farm, Martha quietly equipped her for the most dangerous stretch of the journey. She handed Clara travel papers under the name Sarah Johnson, a free woman headed north to visit relatives. It was a simple story, but one that, if spoken with confidence, could be the thin line between suspicion and safety on the roads. The final leg carried Clara through the ridges and hollows of western Virginia into Pennsylvania, on trails carved over decades by the Underground Railroad. She traveled mostly by night, guided by conductors who knew every rock and river, crossing men and women who risked everything to walk alongside strangers seeking freedom. The mountains were cruel in the darkness, narrow paths, sudden drops, the constant threat of a wrong turn. But every step carried her farther from the world that had once owned her. The thought gave her strength. As she climbed toward freedom, Clara reflected on what had driven her to strike the match. Years of insults, lashes, broken promises, yes. But also something deeper. A refusal to let her existence be reduced to labor and obedience. Sewn against her heart, her mother's seed pouch reminded her of who she was before chains and cotton fields. Those tiny seeds represented a lineage untouched by slavery stories and traditions that still lived within her. They also held a promise that new life could be planted even in strange soil, that beauty and survival could flourish together. On October 1st, 2 weeks after she had set Whitmore's empire ablaze, Clara reached the crest of a ridge and saw the valley of Pennsylvania stretching out before her. Free soil. The sight broke something loose inside her, a swell of relief, pride, and sorrow all tangled together. She was leaving behind more than a plantation. She was leaving behind people she loved, bound by chains she could not break for them. Crossing the border did not mean the danger was over. The Fugitive Slave Act still gave hunters the right to pursue her, even in free states, and the bounty on her head would tempt seasoned trackers. Real safety lay farther north in Canada, or in a hidden community willing to shield her identity. The man who guided her across the line, Robert, knew this truth well. A free black man who had escaped South Carolina 20 years earlier, he understood the weight of freedom as only someone who had once been enslaved could. Freedom's harder than most people expect. Robert told her as they walked together through the quiet Pennsylvania countryside. You spend your whole life being told what to do, and when that chain's gone, it's up to you to decide who you're going to be. Clara listened, the seed pouch pressed against her heart, and realized that for the first time in her life, the choice was hers. Robert's warning stayed with Clara. Freedom wasn't just about slipping the chains, it was about learning how to live without them. She quickly discovered how true that was. Choices most people took for granted, where to sleep, what to eat, how to spend her time, felt strange and unfamiliar after 12 years of having every detail of her life dictated by others. Trusting her own judgment was a skill she had to build from the ground up. The Quaker settlement that received her in Pennsylvania gave her the space and guidance to do just that. It wasn't only a safe haven. It was a place built to help men and women like Clara rebuild their lives. The community offered schooling work and legal aid, not just survival, but the means to create a future. Through that winter of 1827 and 1828, Clara lived among them, working in the textile mill during the day and studying by firelight at night. Her years in Whitmore's fields had honed an expert's touch with cotton, and now for the first time, that knowledge was valued rather than stolen. She earned wages for her labor money that belonged to her alone, and the simple act of deciding how to spend it carried a power nearly as great as the fire she had lit back in Virginia. It was the first time her work meant both survival and choice. Evenings were devoted to learning. The Quakers handed her a Bible and newspapers, and each word she sounded out felt like prying open a locked door. Literacy had been denied to her deliberately, a weapon used to keep her powerless, and with every sentence she mastered, Clara claimed back something her enslavers had tried to erase. Reading gave her eyes into a world she'd been kept from ideas, debates, and most of all, news. From those newspapers, Clara learned what her fire had helped to set in motion. On September 20th, as planned, enslaved people across Virginia, the Carolinas, and beyond carried out coordinated escapes and acts of sabotage. The scale overwhelmed patrols and militia, leaving the system shaken. Back at Whitmore Plantation, the story ended much as Clara had dreamed. Insurance companies refused to cover the losses of a fire set by arson, and without compensation, Whitmore's fortune collapsed. By spring 1828, he was forced to sell most of his remaining enslaved workers, breaking apart the plantation dynasty that had carried his family's wealth for 3 generations. The news brought Clara a storm of emotions. Satisfaction that her former master's empire had burned to ash, but also sorrow. Every person sold to cover Whitmore's debts paid a price for her defiance. Families were torn apart, lives, uprooted futures, rewritten without consent. Clara understood then that rebellion carried a cost. No one could calculate cleanly, a moral weight that could not be escaped. By spring, Clara was no longer just surviving. She was planning. The seed pouch sewn into her dress still pressed against her chest each day, reminding her of roots deeper than cotton fields or bondage. She had made it through fire and wilderness, through choices that would haunt and strengthen her both. Now, in free soil, she faced the hardest question yet. Not how to escape, but how to truly live free. The Quaker settlement had sheltered Clara through the first fragile months of freedom. But she knew that safety and permanence required more than refuge. It required building a life in a larger world. Letters from former bondspeople in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York painted vivid pictures of opportunity and danger alike. These northern cities promised schools, employment, and vibrant, free black communities, but they also carried the ever-present threat of racial prejudice, economic struggle, and the long reach of slave catchers who prowled the crowded streets. Philadelphia drew Clara's choice. Its large population of free black residents, established abolitionist networks, and reputation as a center of anti-slavery activism made it a place where her hard-earned skills might be turned into stability. But moving there meant adjusting again, this time to a society layered with its own divisions. Philadelphia's black community was not a single unified whole. It contained men and women born free, others who had bought their liberty, and those like Clara who had risked everything in flight. The differences created tension, and not everyone welcomed newcomers who might draw unwanted attention. Clara had to learn to walk carefully among people who understood her struggle, yet sometimes saw her as a liability. She found her footing in familiar work. A textile factory hired her to process cotton shipped from the South. Ironic labor considering its origin, but it gave her steady wages and allowed her to stand on her own. There she met others who had escaped enslavement, people who carried the same mixture of scars and determination. Together, they formed an informal network of support, sharing advice, resources, and shelter in times of need. The literacy skills she had painstakingly gained during her Quaker winter soon proved invaluable. Clara volunteered with mutual aid groups, reading contracts, writing petitions, and keeping records. Her competence and lived experience quickly drew the attention of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, where she began working officially. There her testimony carried unusual weight. She had not only endured slavery, but had fought back in a way few could imagine. And her knowledge of escape routes and plantation systems gave her a unique voice among activists. Clara soon found herself standing before audiences in meeting halls and churches across Pennsylvania and New York. She spoke of Whitmore plantation of fire and flight of nights spent in swamps and forests, and of the fragile first steps of freedom. Each speech asked her to reopen wounds she would rather leave closed, but she did it knowing her words reached people who otherwise treated slavery as an abstraction. In her voice they could hear the cost of bondage and the courage of resistance. By 1829, whispers began to reach her of renewed investigations in Virginia. The authorities had never forgotten the fire that destroyed Whitmore's empire, and they still sought the one responsible. Clara's name was never spoken aloud in those circles, but she knew the danger had not passed. Even as her story became a rallying cry for abolitionists, somewhere men with badges and bounties were still hunting for the woman who had turned a plantation into ash. Bounty hunters never stopped searching for Clara. Her description circulated constantly among sheriffs and marshals, and the reward for her capture remained large enough to tempt professionals who made their living hunting human beings. That reality forced her to live under false names, to avoid gatherings where she might be recognized, and to measure every new friendship against the possibility of betrayal. The strain was heavy, but Clara refused to let fear define her. She built a life in Philadelphia, balancing caution with purpose, becoming a steady hand in the free black community, and a tireless worker in the abolitionist cause. Her greatest satisfaction came from helping others who followed the same perilous road she had traveled. Fugitive men and women arriving in Philadelphia often found themselves lost in a maze of strange streets and hostile laws. Clara became one of the first friendly faces many saw, guiding them through the challenges of free life, while teaching them that survival meant more than just escape. Through it all, the small seed pouch her mother had given her remained close, its weight against her chest, reminding her daily of where she came from, and of the strength carried forward from generations past. By 1830, Clara made the decision to plant those seeds at last. Behind the boarding house where she lived, she carved out a small garden and set them carefully into the earth, fulfilling a promise she had made to herself in her darkest days of slavery, that one day she would see them grow in free soil. The flowers that emerged were unlike anything native to Pennsylvania, bright blossoms from another continent taking root in the north. For Clara, they were more than plants. They were proof that she too could bloom in foreign ground, carrying her heritage into a new life of her own making. The garden drew neighbors who shared her love of cultivating beauty and memory, deepening her sense of belonging in Philadelphia. By the third anniversary of her escape in September 1830, Clara had transformed from a frightened fugitive into a respected advocate, speaking confidently before audiences that sometimes numbered in the hundreds. Her story spread beyond the city, whispered in slave quarters across the South as evidence that resistance was possible, and repeated by abolitionists in the North as proof that slavery could never fully crush the human spirit. The fire at Whitmore Plantation had become legend, remembered not just as the destruction of a wealthy man's fortune, but as a spark of defiance that showed enslaved people could fight back. Yet Clara never let herself believe her freedom was enough. She knew millions remained in chains, and she tied her future to the larger struggle for emancipation. Work with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society put her shoulder to that wheel, even as progress moved painfully slow. By the early 1830s, the country was tearing itself apart over slavery. Southern legislatures passed harsher restrictions, while northern states inched toward complete abolition. Moderates still argued for gradual change, but abolitionists demanded immediate freedom. Clara's story became ammunition in those debates. Her experience revealed not just the cruelty of slavery, but the possibility of resistance. In 1831, her voice reached farther still with the publication of her memoir. With the help of white abolitionists who shaped her narrative for a broad audience, Clara put her life into words, the brutality of the plantation, the fire that had consumed Whitmore's wealth, the perilous journey through woods and rivers, and the fragile beginnings of life in freedom. The book cemented her as not only a survivor, but a witness and a symbol. Her testimony fueling a movement that was beginning to believe more than ever that slavery's days were numbered. Clara's memoir took the North by storm. Sold in thousands of copies across Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. It gave her not only financial independence, but also a platform that few formerly enslaved people ever achieved. For Northern readers who had never set foot on a plantation, her words made slavery real in a way no second-hand account could. Yet the book's success carried a double edge. It made her story immortal, but it also made her a target. Bounty hunters now had not just a vague description, but a published record of her face, her voice, and her movements. Clara adapted by changing her routines, walking different routes to work, and avoiding habits that could make her predictable. Living under constant threat demanded vigilance, but she refused to retreat into silence. Her very visibility as a free, articulate, and capable black woman was a form of defiance, challenging the lie that slavery was natural or necessary. In the years that followed, Clara's life deepened in ways she had once thought impossible. She married a man who, like her, had escaped bondage in the Carolinas. Together, they built a home in Philadelphia, not only as partners in love, but as allies in the ongoing fight against slavery. Their choice to raise children was itself an act of resistance, a declaration that freedom was not just for them, but for generations yet to come. When her son was born in 1834, Clara wept to know that his first breath carried no chain, that he would inherit not servitude, but the legacy of struggle and courage that had defined her own life. The 1830s brought momentum to the abolitionist movement, and Clara was at its heart. Testimonies like hers turned abstract moral arguments into living proof of slavery's cruelty and of enslaved people's capacity for survival, leadership, and brilliance. The Underground Railroad grew stronger, carrying thousands northward along the very paths Clara had once traveled. Meanwhile, the story of the Whitmore fire spread through the South like a whispered song. For those still in bondage, it became legend proof that even a single enslaved woman could bring down the wealth of a master. Clara's name became folklore, her act of defiance retold as hope itself. Yet Clara herself understood that freedom required more than symbols. She dedicated the bulk of her life not to retelling her escape, but to the steady, patient work of organizing communities, building schools, raising funds, and shaping public opinion. Her transformation from enslaved field hand to fugitive rebel, from fugitive to author, from author to organizer, was proof of the vast potential that slavery had always tried to deny. Her speeches and writings became ammunition in the push for immediate emancipation, strengthening abolitionist resolve in an increasingly divided nation. By the 1840s, Clara could measure more than a decade of freedom behind her. She had survived the hunt, built a home, raised a child, and forged a reputation as both survivor and leader. The fire, she said, in Virginia had once been an act of destruction, but it became the cornerstone of a new life devoted to building networks, communities, and movements that would outlast her. Every summer, her garden bloomed with the flowers grown from her mother's seeds, their roots deep in Pennsylvania soil. Neighbors gathered there to share stories, trade knowledge, and remember the strength of those who had come before. To Clara, the flowers stood as a promise-fulfilled proof that the past could live on in beauty, that survival could turn into growth, and that freedom could be cultivated like a living thing. The young woman who vanished into the forest after burning Whitmore's cotton had become living proof that slavery could not break the human spirit. Clara Robinson's life embodied the truth that individual courage could ignite larger movements, that defiance could become legacy, and that the seeds of resistance once planted would continue to bloom long after her own story had been told. The fire Clara set in 1827 had not just freed her body, it had lit the path toward a future no enslaved woman could have dared to imagine. Her disappearance from Whitmore Plantation was not an ending, but the moment her life truly began. By the late 1840s, as the United States fractured over the question of slavery's expansion into the West, Clara stood not only as a voice of resistance, but as proof that the system's foundations were crumbling. Her memoir, once whispered through abolitionist circles in the North, had crossed oceans. Translated into multiple languages, it became part of a global dialogue about liberty, human rights, and the contradictions at the heart of American democracy. European abolitionists saw in Clara's story not only the cruelty of slavery, but the courage of resistance, and they invited her to London and Paris to share her testimony. In Britain, Clara met with parliamentarians who had dismantled slavery across the empire, learning the tactics of coalition building and legislative pressure that had forced systemic change. In Paris, she entered salons alive with revolutionary ideas, where thinkers tied her experiences to global struggles against tyranny and oppression. For the first time, Clara saw her fire at Whitmore not just as an act of survival or rebellion, but as one thread in a worldwide tapestry of liberation movements. International acclaim, however, sharpened the dangers she faced. American bounty hunters, enraged that her testimony was fueling criticism abroad, sought to silence her permanently. European abolition societies assigned her bodyguards, and she lived with the constant awareness that assassination or kidnapping were not impossible threats, but daily risks. Still, she pressed forward, believing her voice was worth more than her fear. When Clara returned to Philadelphia in 1849, she found herself transformed. No longer just a witness, she was an international figure whose credibility could move both black and white audiences. Her presence united factions of the abolition movement that had long struggled to work together, making her indispensable in building the coalitions needed for political change. Then came the shock of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act shattered the fragile barrier between North and South, declaring that no black person in free states was safe. Federal officials were now required to aid in the capture of fugitives, and accused runaways were denied trials, testimony, or protection under the law. It was as if the whip and chain had reached across the Mason-Dixon line. For Clara, it was a personal threat and a call to action. She threw herself into organizing resistance. Alongside black and white allies, she helped build networks of safe houses, legal defense funds, and rapid communication systems to warn of slave catcher raids. She taught others the strategies of concealment, deception, and escape she herself had once relied upon. The work was perilous. Federal law demanded harsh penalties for anyone aiding fugitives, but Clara refused to step back. She had always believed her freedom meant nothing if it could not be shared. The same courage that once carried her through fire and forest now guided her through city streets, under surveillance courthouse steps, heavy with danger, and meeting halls thick with tension. She understood better than most. Freedom was not a gift to be guarded for oneself, but a torch to be carried forward no matter the cost. The 1850s marked a shift from words to weapons, and Clara saw it coming with a heavy heart. What had once been argued in Congress and newspapers was now being fought with rifles in Kansas, where blood spilled in fields and cabins over whether slavery would define the new territories. To Clara, it was proof that compromise was collapsing and that the nation was heading toward a reckoning long delayed. From her network of Underground Railroad contacts, she learned how much harder it had become to escape. Her own act of rebellion and the many that followed had frightened planters into doubling down. Patrols grew larger, punishments, more brutal laws, more restrictive. Enslavers invested in chains, hounds, and watchtowers to close off every exit they could imagine. Yet despite the tightening noose, the Underground Railroad did not wither, it expanded. And Clara was one of its architects. By mid-decade, she was no longer just a survivor or speaker, but a coordinator, helping manage escapes that spanned multiple states. She traveled the Northeast and Midwest, visiting free Black communities, strengthening safe house networks, and training others in concealment and communication. She gathered intelligence on bounty hunters and patrol routes, then passed it along so others could slip through. Her son, growing up in the heart of this movement, learned early that freedom was not a gift, but a duty. Clara made sure he knew the history of their family, the price of liberty, and the responsibility to defend it. She taught him to read to lead, and to see himself as part of a struggle larger than any one life. As the decade wore on, Clara crossed paths with more radical abolitionists who believed that speeches and petitions had run their course. They spoke openly of armed insurrection, of meeting violence with violence. Clara respected their fire, but she feared the destruction it might unleash. When John Brown led his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 and was executed for treason, Clara was shaken. She admired his courage, his refusal to accept slavery's permanence, but she questioned whether his gamble had been wise. His death hardened divisions, inspiring some, while making reconciliation nearly impossible. Clara's own response was to turn inward toward memory and preservation. She launched a project to collect the testimonies of those who had freed themselves, men and women, whose escapes, rebellions, and daily acts of defiance had chipped away at the system for generations. She traveled town to town, interviewing fugitives who had built new lives in the North. Each account revealed a different face of slavery and a different path to freedom. In listening, Clara came to see her own fire at Whitmore, not as an isolated blaze, but as one flame in a vast unbroken chain of resistance stretching back to the first ships that carried Africans to American shores. Then came 1860. Abraham Lincoln's election, won without a single Southern vote, tore the nation apart. Secession began almost immediately. For Clara, it was both terrifying and promising. War meant blood suffering and uncertainty, but it also meant the possibility that the United States might finally be forced to confront the contradiction it had carried since birth. As the country lurched toward civil war, Clara braced herself, knowing the struggle she had waged in secret and in public was about to become the nation's struggle as a whole. Clara entered the 1860s with both hope and dread. She knew war might be the only way slavery would end, but she also feared the terrible price the nation would pay in blood. When Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the conflict she had long anticipated became reality. From the first days of the war, Clara dedicated herself fully to the Union cause, organizing supplies for soldiers, and more importantly, aiding the thousands of enslaved people who fled toward Union lines. The small secret acts of resistance that had defined her early years were now dwarfed by an exodus of human beings who saw the advancing blue uniforms as their chance at liberation. Because Clara herself had once walked the path from bondage to freedom, she was called upon to advise Union officials struggling to manage the contraband crisis, the sudden arrival of tens of thousands of freed men, women, and children. She pushed for policies that recognized them not as property to be seized, but as people ready to build lives of their own. Her insight helped shape relief programs that provided food, shelter, and opportunities for work, laying the early foundations of what would become Reconstruction efforts. In September 1862, Lincoln announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. For Clara, it was the moment she had believed in. Since the night she set fire to Whitmore's cotton sheds, proof that slavery and democracy could not exist side by side forever. When the final proclamation was issued on January 1, 1863, she stood among the jubilant crowds in Philadelphia, tears on her face, as bells rang out to mark the beginning of a new era. For her, it was both a personal vindication and a collective triumph, decades of resistance, both quiet and loud, converging into law. Yet Clara never let celebration blind her to reality. Freedom on paper was only the first step. True equality would require the same persistence that had carried her from Virginia's fields to Philadelphia's meeting halls. She warned that without education, economic opportunity, and political protection, emancipation could collapse into something hollow. The struggle was not over. It had simply changed shape. Near the war's end, Clara returned to Virginia as part of Union relief work. The journey back broke and healed her in equal measure. She walked among the very landscapes that had once confined her, seeing them now stripped of the wealth and order slavery had imposed. Whitmore Plantation lay in ruins, its big house, abandoned, its cotton fields choked with weeds. The 3 storage sheds she had torched in 1827 stood as collapsed skeletons of charred timber weathered by nearly 4 decades. Standing there, Clara felt the weight of her life's arc. From a young woman who had risked everything for one act of rebellion, to a leader in the movement that had made emancipation national law, her journey was carved into the ashes before her. The fire she set had been just a spark, but it had joined countless others until the whole system burned away. And in that moment, staring at the remnants of Whitmore's empire, Clara Robinson knew the truth. What had begun as survival had become history. When Clara returned to Virginia after the war, she sought out the people who had once shared her life in bondage. Some had stayed near the old plantation, making lives for themselves in freedom on familiar ground. Others had scattered across the South and North, searching for lost family members or new opportunities. The reunions were bittersweet. There was joy in seeing survivors alive and free, but also grief for those who had not lived to see emancipation and sorrow for the years stolen by slavery. Her return also gave her the chance to speak directly to newly freed men and women, standing on the threshold of liberty, their lives suddenly unshackled yet uncertain. Clara told her own story openly, reminding them that freedom brought both possibilities and struggles. Her testimony carried weight because she had lived what they were now beginning to face: the fear, the adjustment, the challenge of carving a life in a world that still resisted their full humanity. But the triumph of Union victory was clouded almost immediately by tragedy. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April 1865 shook Clara and the abolitionist movement to its core. Lincoln had embodied, however imperfectly, the promise of a new beginning. His death left lingering questions about whether his successor would carry forward the commitment to justice and equality, or retreat in the face of Southern resistance. Through Reconstruction, Clara poured her energy into education, suffrage, and economic empowerment. She knew freedom could not be sustained by law alone. It required tools, schools for children, voting rights for men, and opportunities to earn a living that did not depend on the goodwill of former masters. Having learned to read and write as an adult, she had a deep empathy for freed people struggling with literacy. She worked tirelessly with both public agencies and private charities to build schools across the South, insisting that knowledge was the surest safeguard of liberty. Her memoir, already a touchstone of the abolitionist movement, continued to find eager readers. New editions included updates about her wartime service and her insights into the challenges of Reconstruction. Americans hungry to understand slavery and its aftermath found in Clara's story both searing testimony and hard-earned wisdom. By the late 1860s, Clara was in her early 60s. She had lived long enough to see slavery at its height and to see it fall in fire and blood. She had stood in the cotton fields as property and in the lecture halls as a leader. She knew the struggle was not over. Racial inequality remained deeply embedded in the country's laws and customs, but she could take satisfaction in knowing that her fire had spread. The true measure of Clara Robinson's life was not only in the night she vanished into the Virginia forest torch in hand, but in the decades of steady labor that followed, building schools, aiding fugitives, shaping laws, and mentoring a new generation of activists. Her journey was proof that an individual act of defiance could spark wider transformation when joined with the patient collective struggle of many. As she entered her final decades, Clara's legacy had already taken root. The flowers she had planted in Pennsylvania soil still bloomed each summer, symbols of memory and resilience. And so too did her life bloom into legend, a story of courage and perseverance passed from freed people to their children and later to their grandchildren. The enslaved girl who once seemed invisible had become a beacon of possibility, an enduring reminder that justice, though slow, could be won by those brave enough to fight for it.